In a corner of what is occasionally termed our Empire of the Northwest, there lies a country of mountains and valleys, where until recently citizens have been few. At the present time, certain minds and uncertain hopes have gathered an eccentric population and evoked some sudden towns. The names which several of these bear are tolerably sumptuous. Golden, Oro, and Ruby, for instance, and in them dwell many colonels and judges, and people who own one suit of clothes and half a name, colored by adjuncts, such as Hurry Up Ed, and who sleep almost anywhere. These communities are brisk, sanguine, and nomadic, full of goodwill and crime, and in each of them you will be likely to find a weekly newspaper, and an editor who is busy writing things about the neighboring editors. The flume slants down the hill, bearing water to the concentrator. Buckets unexpectedly swing out from the steep pines into midair, sailing along their wire to the mill. Little new starring shanties appear daily. Somebody having trouble in a saloon upsets a lamp, and half the town goes to ashes, while the colonels and hurry-up eds carouse over the fireworks till morning. In a short while, there are more little shanties than ever, and the burnt district is forgotten. All this is going on not far from the Mountain Goat, but it is a forlorn distance from the railroad, and except for the stage line which the recent mining towns have necessitated, my route to the goat country might have been too prolonged and uncertain to attempt. I stepped down one evening from the stage, the last public conveyance I was to see, after a journey that certainly has one good side. It is completely odious, and the breed of sportsman that takes into camp every luxury, excepting, perhaps, cracked ice, will not be tempted to infest the region until civilization has smoothed its path. The path, to be sure, does not roughen until one has gone along it for 2,800 miles. You may leave New York in the afternoon, and arrive very early indeed on the 5th day at Spokane. Here the luxuries begin to lessen, and a mean once-a-day train trundles you away on a branch west of Spokane at 6 in the morning into a landscape that wastes into a galloping consumption. Before noon, the last sick tree, the ultimate starved blade of wheat, has perished from sight, and you come up to the end of all things, it would seem, a domain of wretchedness unspeakable. Not even a warm, brilliant sun can galvanize the corpse of the bare, ungainly earth. The railroad goes no further. It is not surprising, and the stage arranges to leave before the train arrives. Thus you spend sunset and sunrise in the moribund terminal town, the inhabitants of which frankly confess that they are not staying from choice. They were floated here by a boom wave which left them stranded. Kindly they were, and anxious to provide the stranger with what comforts existed. Geographically, I was in the Big Bend country, a bulk of land looped in by the Columbia River and highly advertised by railroads for the benefit of those seeking homes. Fruit and grain no doubt grow somewhere in it. What I saw was a desert cracked in two by a chasm 65 miles long. It rained in the night, and at 7 next morning, bound for Port Columbia, we wallowed northward out of town, in the sweating canvas-colored stage through primeval mud. After some 18 miles, we drew out of the rain area, and from around the wheels there immediately rose and came among us some primeval dust, monstrous, shapeless, and blind. First your power of speech deserted you, then your eyesight went, and at length you became uncertain whether you were alive. Then hilarity of the sheer discomfort overtook me, and I was joined in it by a brother American, but two Jew drummers on the back seat could not understand, and seemed on the verge of tears. The landscape was entirely blotted out by the dust. Often you could not see the roadside, if the road had any side. We may have been passing homes and fruit trees, but I think not. I remember wondering if getting goat after all, but they proved well worth it. Toward evening we descended into a sullen valley of the Columbia, which rushes along, sunk below the level of the desert we had crossed. High, sterile hills flank its course, and with the sweeping, unfriendly speed of the stream, its bleak shores seemed a chilly place for homeseekers. Yet I blessed the change. A sight of running water once more, even in this overbearing flood, and of hills however dreary, was exhilaration after the degraded, stingy monotony of the Big Bend. The alkali trails in Wyoming do not seem paradises till you bring your memory of them there. Nor am I alone in my estimate of this impossible hole. There is a signpost sticking up in the middle of it that originally told the traveler that it was 35 miles to Central Ferry, but now the traveler has retorted, and 3 different handwritings on this signpost reveal to you that you have had predecessors in your thought, comrades who shared your sorrows. 45 miles to water, 75 miles to wood, and then the last word, 2½ miles to hell. Perhaps they were homeseekers. We halted for a moment at the town of Bridgeport, identified by one wooden store and an inchoate hotel. The rest may be seen upon blueprint maps, where you would suppose Bridgeport was a teeming metropolis. At Port Columbia, which we reached by a landslide sort of road that slanted the stage over and put the twin Jew drummers in mortal fear, we slept in one of the 2 buildings which indicate that town. It is another important center in blueprint, but invisible to the naked eye. In the morning, a rope ferry floated the new stage and us travelers across the river. The Okanagan flows south from lakes and waters above the British line and joins the Columbia here. We entered its valley at once, crossing it soon by another rope ferry and keeping northward. With the river to the east between us and the Colville Reservation, we had one good meal at noon, and entering the smaller valley, reached Ruby that evening. Here the stage left me to continue its journey to Conconnelly, 6 miles further on. With the friends who had come to meet me, I ascended out of Ruby the next day over the abrupt hill westward, and passing one night out in my blankets near a hospitable but limited cabin, its flowing-hair host fed us, played us the fiddle, and would have had us slept inside. Arrived bag and baggage the 4th day from the railroad at the forks of the Methaw River, the next tributary of the Columbia below the Okanagan. Here was a smiling country, winning the heart at sight. An ample beauty was over everything nature had accomplished in this place. The pleasant trees and clear course of the stream, a fertile soil on the levels, the slopes of the foothills varied and gentle, unencumbered by woods, the purple cloak of forest above these on the mountains, and rising from the valley's head, a crown of white, clean frozen peaks. These are known to some as the Isabella Range, and Mount Gardner, though the maps do not name them. Moreover, I heard that now I was within 25 miles of Goats, and definite ridges were pointed out as the Promised Land. Many things were said to me, first and last. I remember a ragged old trapper, lately come over the mountains from the Skagit River. Goats, did I say? On top there the goats had tangled your feet walking in the trail. He had shot 2 in camp for staring at him. Another accurate observer had seen 300 on a hill just above early winter as he was passing by. The cabined dwellers on the Methaw tied their horses to the fence and talked to me. So I had come from the east after goats, had I? And in the store of the man at the forks I became something of a curiosity. Day by day I sat on the kegs of nails, or lay along the counter devoted to his dry goods, and heard what passed. Citizens and denizens, for the Siwash and his squaws and horses were having his autumn hunt in the valley, knocked at the door to get their mail, or buy tobacco, or sell horns and fur, or stare for an hour and depart with a grunt. And the grave man at the forks stood behind one counter while I lay on the other, acquiring a miscellaneous knowledge. One old medical gentleman had slain all wild animals without weapons, and had been the personal friend of so many distinguished historical characters that we computed he was 19 about the time of Bunker Hill. They were hospitable with their information, and I followed my rule of believing everything that I hear. And they were also hospitable with whatever they possessed. The memory of those distant dwellers among the mountains, young and old, is a friendly one, like the others I carry, whether of Wind or Powder Rivers, or the Yellowstone, or wherever western trails have led me. Yet disappointment and failure were the first things. There was all the zeal you could wish. We had wedged painfully into a severe country, 12 miles in 2 days, and trail cutting between, when sickness turned us back, goatless. By this time, October was almost gone, and the last 3 days of it went in patching up our disintegrated outfit. We needed other men and other horses, and while these were being sought, nothing was more usual than to hear, if we'd only been along with so-and-so, he saw goats here and there and apparently everywhere. We had, it would seem, ingenuously selected the only place where there were none, but somehow the services of so-and-so could not be procured. He had gone to town, or was busy getting his winter's meat, or his married daughter had just come to visit him, or he had married somebody else's daughter. I cannot remember the number of obstacles always lying between ourselves and so-and-so. At length we were once more in camp on a stream called the Twisp. In the morning, new stroke of misfortune, one of us was threatened with illness and returned to the Forks. We three, the guide, the cook, and myself, went on, finally leaving the narrow valley, and climbed 4 hours up a mountain at the rate of about a mile an hour. The question was, had winter come in the park above, for which we were heading? On top, we skirted a bare ridge from which everything fell precipitously away, and curving round along a steep hollow of the hill, we came to an edge and saw the snow lying plentifully among the pines, through which we must go down into the bottom of the park. But on the other side, where the sun came, there was little or none, and it was a most beautiful place. At the head of it was a little frozen lake fringed with tamarack, and a stream flowed down from this, through scattered birches and pines, with good pasture for the horses between. The park sank at its outlet into a tall, impassable canyon through which the stream joined the Twisp miles below. It was a little lap of land clear at the top of the mountains, the final peaks and ridges of which rose all around, walling it in completely. You must climb those to be able to see into it, and the only possible approach for pack horses was the pine tree slant down which we came. Of course there was no trail. We prospected before venturing, and T, the guide, shook his head. It was only a question of days, possibly of hours, when snow must shut the place off from the world until spring. But T appreciated the 3,000 miles I had come for goats, and if the worst came to the worst, said he, we could make it in to the Forks on foot, leading the horses and leaving behind all baggage that weighed anything. So we went down. Our animals slipped a little, the snow balling their feet, but nothing happened, and we reached the bottom and chose a camp in a clump of tamarack and pine. The little stream, passing through shadows here, ran under a lid of frozen snow, easily broken, and there was plenty of wood, and on the ground only such siftings of snow as could be swept clean for the tent. The saddles were piled handily under a tree, a good fireplace was dug, we had a comfortable supper, and nothing remained but that the goats should be where they ought to be, on the ridges above the park. I have slept more soundly. Doubt and hope kept my thoughts active. Yet even so, it was pleasant to wake in the quiet and hear the bell on our horse. Duster occasionally tanker somewhere in the hill. My watch I had forgotten to place at T's disposal, so he was reduced to getting the time of day from the stars. He consulted the Great Bear, and seeing this constellation at an angle he judged to indicate 5 o'clock, he came back into the tent, and I heard him wake the cook, who crawled out of his blankets. "Why, it's plumb night," the cook whined. "Make the breakfast," said T. I opened my eyes and shut them immediately in despair at the darkness that I saw. Presently I heard the fire in the pans, and knew that the inevitable had come. So I got my clothes on and looked at my watch. It was only 4:30 a.m. T and the Great Bear had made half an hour's miscalculation, and the face of the cook was so grievous that I secretly laughed myself entirely awake. Plum night lasted some time longer. I had leisure to eat 2 plates of oatmeal and maple syrup, some potato and onion soup, bacon, and coffee, and digest these before dawn showed. T and I left camp at 6:40 a.m., The day was a dark one. On the high peaks behind camp, great mounds of cloud moved and swung, and the sky was entirely overcast. We climbed one of the lower ridges, not a hard climb nor long, but very sliding, and often requiring hands and feet to work round a ledge. From the top we could see the open country lying comfortably below and out of reach of the howling wind that cut across the top of the mountain, straight from the Puget Sound, bringing all that it could carry of the damp of the Pacific. The ridges and summits that surrounded our park continually came into sight and disappeared again among the dense vapors which bore down upon them. We went cautiously along the narrow top of crumbling slate, where the pines were scarce and stunted, and had twisted themselves into corkscrews so they might grip the ground against the tearing force of storms. We came on a number of fresh goat tracks in the snow or the soft shale. These are the reverse of those of the mountain sheep, the V which the hooves make having its open end in the direction the animal is going. There seemed to be several, large and small. The perverted animals invariably chose the sharpest slant they could find to walk on, often with a decent level just beside it that we were glad enough to have. If there were a precipice and a sound flat top, they took the precipice, and crossed its face on juts that did not look as if your hat would hang on them. In this I think they are worse than the mountain sheep, if that's possible. Certainly they do not seem to come down into the high pastures and feed on the grass levels, as the sheep will. T and I hoped we should find a bunch, but that was not to be, in spite of the indications. As we continued, I saw a singular-looking stone lying on a little ledge some way down the mountain ahead. I decided it must be a stone, and was going to speak of it, when the stone moved, and we crouched in the slanting gravel. T had been making up his mind it was a stone. The goat turned his head our way, but did not rise. He was 200 yards across a split in the mountain, and the wind blowing hard. T wanted me to shoot, but I did not dare to run such a chance. I have done a deal of missing at 200 yards, and much nearer too. So I climbed or crawled out of sight, keeping any stone or little bush between me and the goat, till I got myself where a buttress of rock hid me, and then I ran along the ridge and down and up the scooping it made by the split of the mountain, and so came cautiously to where I could peer over and see the goat lying turned away from me with his head commanding the valley. He was on a tiny shelf of snow. Beside him was one small pine, and below that the rock fell away steeply into the gorge. Ought I to have bellowed at him, and at least got him on his legs? I know it would have been more honorable. He looked white and huge and strange, and somehow I had a sense of personality about him, more vivid than any since I watched my first silvertip lift a rotten log, and sitting on his hind legs make a breakfast on beetles, picking them off the log with one paw. I fired, aiming behind the goat's head. He did not rise, but turned his head around. The white bead of my lineman's sight had not showed well against the white animal, and I thought I had missed him. Then I fired again, and he rolled very little, 6 inches, and lay quiet. He could not have been more than 50 yards away, and my first shot had cut through the back of his neck and buried itself in mortal places, and the second in his head merely made death instantaneous. Shooting him after he had become alarmed might have lost him over the edge. Even if a first shot had been fatal, it could not have been fatal soon enough. 2 struggles on that snow would have sent him sliding through space. As it was, we had a steep, unsafe scramble down through the snow to where he lay, stretched out on the little shelf by the tree. He was a fair-sized billy and very heavy. The little lifting and shoving we had to do, and skinning him was hard work. The horns were black, slender, slightly spreading, curved backward, pointed, and smooth. They measured 6 inches round the base, and the distance from one point to the other, measured down one horn, along the skull and up the other, was 21.5 inches. The hooves were also black and broad and large, wholly unlike a tame goat's. The hair was extraordinarily thick, long, and of a weather-beaten white, the eye large and deep brown. I had my invariable attack of remorse on looking closely at the poor harmless old gentleman, and wondered what achievement, after all, could be discerned in this sort of surprise and murder. We did not think of securing any of his plentiful fat, but with head and hide alone, climbed back up the ticklish slant, hung the trophies on a tree in a gap on the camp side of the ridge, and continued our hunt. It was not 10 o'clock yet, and we had taken 1 hour to skin the goat. We now hunted the higher ridges behind camp until 1 p.m., finding tracks that made it seem as if a number of goats must be somewhere nearby. But the fog came down and shut everything out of sight. Moreover, the wind on top blew so that we could not have seen had it been clear. We returned to camp and found it greatly improved. The cook had carpentered an important annex to the tent. By slanting pine logs against a ridge pole and nailing them, he had built a room, proof against wind and rain, and in it a table. One end was against the opening of the tent, the other at the fire. The arrangement was excellent, and timely also. The storm revived during the night, and it rained fitfully. The roar of the wind coming down from the mountain into our pack sounded like a Niagara, and its approach was tremendous. We had built up a barrier of pine brush, and this, with a clump of trees, sheltered us well enough. But there were wild moments when the gust struck us, and the tent shuddered and strained, until that particular breeze passed on with a diminishing roar down the canyon.